Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Product Backlog, AntiPatterns, an Introduction to Forensic Analysis. My name is Eric Neighberg, and I'll be your host today, bringing some of the questions to our speaker, Stefan Wolpers. Welcome, Stefan.
Hi, Eric. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for joining. This is one of our Scrum Pulse webinars, which we run at least one, try to run several a month to help you, people in the Scrum community, learn, grow, and expand your knowledge of Scrum. If you can go to the next slide real quick. So your microphones will be muted throughout, but the session will be recorded. If you have to leave early or you want to share it with others, it'll be up on the Scrum.org website within the next 24 hours. Please ask your questions. You can see the question tab on your screen and you can ask questions there. We'll take them throughout the session and I'll be bringing them to Stefan as they make sense. Next slide. So just briefly, who is Scrum.org for those of you who are new? Scrum.org is founded by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. Ken continues as our chairman in running our organization. We're built on the basis of kind of four tenets, all based on our mission, which is to help people and teams solve complex problems. We provide thought leadership like this webinar, training to help you learn, certification and assessments to help you understand your knowledge and validate that knowledge, and then continuous ongoing learning through learning paths and other materials to help people keep growing and keep growing their knowledge. We do this on a consistent basis. All of our trainers teaching the same content, same material all around the world, but bringing their own expertise and knowledge to the classroom to help you learn, as you're going to learn from Stefan today. We're global. We have 345, I believe, trainers now all over the world teaching professional Scrum, and we'd like to build this as part of a community. Next slide. So with that, I will let Stefan introduce himself and enter the presentation. Thanks, Stefan.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eric. So a few seconds about my person. I started with Scrum and extreme programming back in 2006. And like in so many cases, Scrum found me. It wasn't the other way around. I'm based in Berlin, in Germany. And I've mainly worked with fast-growing venture capital-backed startups or large corporations. So the two opposite sides of the spectrum, so to speak. And I spent quite a lot of time in the Agile community. So I'm regularly blogging on Scrum.org or my own website, Age of Product. Some of you may know my newsletter. It's Food for Agile Thought. I curate weekly. I also host a quite large Slack community that is really helpful if you're looking for support. And of course, we have a local meetup group here that is now going, of course, virtual. And if there is time, I also organize a local conference, a barcamp here in Berlin for about 200 people. That is tremendous fun as well. So what I would like to walk you through is some of my learnings from working with product backlogs and various organizations over the course of the years. And just a brief recap. So the product backlog is one of the three artifacts that we have in Scrum, and it's the place where we put all the work that we know of will be necessary to achieve the next product goal and in the long term, the product vision for the product or service we're offering. So it's a critical artifact in my experience. Let me summarize it bluntly: garbage in, garbage out, right? No matter how good your Scrum team is, no matter how good you are at self-management, no matter how technically well-versed you are, and no matter that you pick Scrum for the right purpose, you know, solving complex adaptive problems, if your backlog isn't right, everyone will notice because your team won't be adding the value it actually could add if the product backlog will be done properly. So here are my top 10 that I have observed over the course of time. So number 10, the oversized product backlog. Transparency is really a good thing, right? We want to be sure that everything that we like to work on is properly represented. The issue I have with that is that it is very hard to actually work actively as a product owner or developer, or not to mention the stakeholder, with a product backlog that is larger than maybe 100, 150 items. So at least this is my personal threshold. So what we want to have in a product backlog is signal, but we like to avoid the noise. And I know creating noise in that definition is very tempting, right? Because it's often a sign that you're busy, that you're really pulling your weight for the organization. However, being busy does not mean that you're actually creating value for the customers. And there's another problem. Personally, I do like to involve the stakeholders in the creation of the product backlog as far as possible. If you have a very large product backlog, however, it is intimidating for most of your stakeholders. You simply will crowd them out, and you will probably lose feedback that you really need to have. So my suggestion always, as a rule of thumb, of course, depending on the context your team is working in, try to limit the size of the product backlog to something of worth of 3 to 6 sprints. So that has been a good average value in my experience. And you simply do so by count the throughput of the team and then do the math. And as far as the others are the other product backlog items are concerned, I would suggest to remove them, put them somewhere else. So number 10, the oversized product backlog, which is closely related to number 9, the product backlog being a random assortment of stuff. Again, transparency is a good thing. We do not have a shadow accounting in Scrum. Everything that needs to go into the product and our service is represented in the product backlog. So if we talk about software, user stories, bugs, non-functional requirements, spikes, you name it. However, what I'm really skeptical about is putting ideas into the product backlog in various stages, or notes. Or what I've also seen is using a product backlog as a repository for documents, so they are easily accessible. All of this means that you're starting to clog the product backlog. You're adding noise with the effects that we already talked about. What you also can often observe in this situation is that there is no working agreement among the team members on the quality a product backlog item should meet. And please note, I'm not advocating to have a definition of ready. That is a tricky thing too. So my suggestion is, if you'd like to avoid this, watch out for stuff, remove stuff, and create different areas for stuff. So for example, if you have an idea pool that is feeding into experiments, which might be feeding into the product backlog once they're validated, put it somewhere else, but don't use the product backlog for that purpose. And the pro tip, check out who is creating this stuff. Probably you will find out that stakeholders who have access to the product backlog, I assume that you use the software, are probably creating those backlog items as well. I would strictly reconsider providing stakeholders with writing access to your product backlog. That is causing more trouble than it is creating a better relationship with them. So another attribute of oversized backlogs is that you'll have a lot of outdated items in them. We were talking earlier about a size of 3 to 6 sprints, so we probably talk about a horizon of 3 months, maybe 4 months. Now, if you have items in your product backlog that are older than this 3-4 months, you should really ask yourself, why are they in there? Apparently, they're not that important that they make it into a sprint planning, so why continue having them there? It's a bit like the approach that Basecamp is using for dealing with bugs. They either fix bugs immediately, or they ignore them. They're not administering them. And this is my suggestion too. Don't use the product backlog to administer product backlog items that might be valuable sometimes down the road. My suggestion is, again, put them somewhere else, or even better, delete them. If you suggest to delete them, you typically hear an outcry. Yeah, we can't do this because it's our documentation, which translates into loss aversion. Or the other typical argument you hear is that, well, we put a lot of work into them and we might need them in the future. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and I strongly recommend no hoarding of product backlog items in your product backlog. So just look out for items that are older than 3 to 4 months and get rid of them. Another observation that is easily to make with product backlogs, if you go through the entries, is how the team is actually working on creating the product backlog items. So you will easily recognize those items that were created by copying and pasting from paragraphs from requirement documents. So full sentences, real paragraphs, etc. pp. Spoiler alert, this is not the purpose of the product backlog. It's not a Jira-based requirement document, let me put it this way. Some product backlog items, if we refer to software again, certainly do not need any form of collaborative discussion, refinement, etc. pp. If you have to update your database, just do so. You don't have to write a short story about that. However, other stories, other product backlog items do need to have a lot of discussion around it. And this is actually the purpose of creating product backlog items, having a collaborative refinement approach, getting everyone on the same page. Why are we doing this? What are we doing and how are we doing this? This is essential for actually creating value for our customers. Think about this, the old approaches from Ron Jeffries, like card conversation confirmation, and of course, Bill Wiggs' invest principle. This is the purpose. A product backlog item in general is a token for having a discussion within the team. So what I always do if I have a look at a new product backlog, I try to figure out those things that were simply created by copying and pasting content from other documents. This always means that there was no discussion among the team. There could be problems at a later stage. We certainly run into them during sprint planning, or worse, during the sprint when we try to work on them. So you look for copy and paste product backlog items. So closely related to that and easily recognizable as well, if you use your product backlog as some sort of Microsoft project planning in disguise. If you can instantly see and feel this. It really looks like a project plan. The items are typically too detailed. There are way too many of them upfront created, and often they are completely estimated. This is really completely defying the idea of empirical process control that we apply in Scrum, right? That we create feedback loops to inspect and increment and adapt what we're planning to do next. The issue here is that, first of all, putting upfront work into the product backlog, it feels good, right? It provides a sense of being in control, which of course is nonsense, given that we are working in a complex environment, and it satisfies our bias for action. Another issue I have with this, and which is really not graspable at first sight. The more work you put up in there up front, the more loss aversion and sunk cost fallacy kick in and make adapting to change harder than before. It's more challenging. So what I always do is I have a look at the product backlog, and I try to understand whether a large number of product backlog items was created in a short period of time at the beginning of the project or at any other moment. This is a clear indication that, again, somehow the intended purpose of the product backlog creation process, the refinement process, was really not lived up by the team. For what reason there might have been. So that's another interesting point you can talk about to the folks on the team. Number 5, refinement, too much, too little. Again, this is about having a closer look at the product backlog items within the product backlog, not just the upcoming, but also the old items, and just get an understanding how they have been working with all of this. So how often have tickets been touched during the refinement sessions? And how long does it take before a product backlog item is, so to speak, good to go? Weeks, month, or is it single session enough? I believe it's a good thing if the developers challenge the product owner whether a suggested product backlog item makes sense and is really creating the value, and it's the best use of the developer's time. However, this refinement haggling, let me put it this way, shouldn't be applied excessively. There's a point where you need to make a decision. It shouldn't create a stalemate over this. And again, I already mentioned I'm not a friend of a definition of ready, and I've seen teams use a definition of ready to actually drag out these kind of discussions to eternity and just at the end not getting anything done. The definition of ready can easily turn into a sort of stage gate process you really need to be aware of. That could be really damaging for the team and for the customers, of course. So I would look out for product backlog items that have a significant change history. So if you use a software like Jira, for example, we can have a look at the change history and just see how many times the ticket was touched, what comments do you have on it, etc. pp. So that is really helpful.
So Stefan, we have a question that I think is perfectly in line with where the conversation is and is going. Avanish asks, what metrics can we track to counter and address the anti-patterns that you've discussed?
Oh, that's really, really simple. Count the number of tickets. Count how long it takes. For example, what lead and cycle time do the tickets have? Right? How many comments were there? How long is the change history? You know, so if you have a ticket that's been put in there once, never discussed, you will see it's a very brief change history because it was created once and then nothing ever happened. Another ticket that might have gone through the process typically will have a change history that shows that, okay, over the course of 3 weeks, the ticket has been changed 4 times or something like that. You know, someone added text, someone deleted text. There probably are comments on the ticket. You know, so all these are indications for how the team is working. So what you have to do, what I always do is seriously, I take an afternoon or a day and I go through the product backlog and look at the tickets. And I take a piece of paper and a pencil, and then I do my counting and my math. Yeah, you don't have to rely on any kind of reporting of the tool. That's typically not necessary.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, then let's go on. So, so far I've been introducing some attributes of the product backlog that stand out in my eyes. Now, the next 4 ones are basically also hidden somewhere in the product backlog, and they probably point to behavior within the organization that is not beneficial for the outcome of the Scrum team. Let me put it this way. Okay, pet projects. I don't know whether you have ever worked on pet projects. So pet projects are typically driven by someone who has a personal interest in getting something done. Could be a stakeholder, the beloved feature a certain stakeholder wants to have and he or she is pushing for it. Or it could be a developer who wants to try a brand new JavaScript framework for the purpose of trying it out in a real project. Or gold plating a solution, adding more quality and more functionality that would have been necessary to actually say, okay, this ticket is done. So in my experience, if you dig a bit deeper into this, if you run some sort of root cause analysis, you will more or less end up with somewhere in the what is in for me corner. So I was working as a Scrum Master for a team, and we were building a certain feature for the product owner, and it somehow did not feel like it would be the most valuable use of our time, but okay, we did it. And 3 months later, we found out that he needed a feature to prop up their own CV because he was already looking for a new position in a different organization. And that organization was very interested in this kind of experience. So you may imagine how we felt that we've been wasting our time working for the closing of a new employment contract. But at the beginning, this is not obvious. However, if you have the chance to look at the product backlog, you probably might find out some of the pet projects that were running in the past, right? If you go through 100, 200 tickets, if you have a look at the product, you will get a sort of sense and feel for what fits into the product rather soon. And typically those pet projects are entries, product backlog items that somehow do not fit into this look and feel of what the product is supposed to be. It's more kind of, you will know them when you see them. But again, you can use the product backlog to figure these things out. Of course, it might be easier to ask someone from the team over a cup of coffee for that, but you can prepare yourself for these kind of discussions. So pet projects, you can also see them within the product backlog.
We've got a question specific to number 4, and then there's some other questions in here.
Cool. Let's do this.
Some we can take throughout, and some we can take at the end. So one that's specific to number 4. Can number 4 also be applied to other organizational projects like top down? How do you tackle those in the context of the product backlog?
Okay. Depending on the context, of course, and every industry, every product is different, but the only way to avoid this is having a classic product owner in the sense of professional Scrum. So an individual who defines what goes into the product backlog and what doesn't. So if the product owner cannot say no, you're already bordering on the probability that your project will get some sort of pet project thrown upon it. So that is my experience. You need to have a good product owner that has the guts to say no. And not in the sense of burning bridges, but in the sense of an adequate stakeholder management, which also is the reason that I'm a big proponent of including the stakeholders as early as possible and as comprehensively as possible with the project, so everyone understands our resources are limited. We can't do everything that would make sense, and we need to come to an understanding what kind of work we do in which order. And there is no space for pet projects. And by the way, pet projects is not just a phenomenon of large organizations. They also happen in startups. it's amazing to see. Anywhere you go, you see them.
Yeah, I've seen them in companies of all sizes. I talk about happy years quite a bit. You have that head of sales who comes back from one client, for example, and next thing you know, we have to make all of these changes for that one client. They never really validate. Would they buy it? Is it interesting to anybody other than that client? I remember one day sitting in my cubicle when I worked at a small startup and had the CEO walk into my cube. Hey, we need to do this, this, and this. I'm like, well, hold on, back up. Let's think about this for a minute. And it's because he had just come out of one meeting and of course was all excited, right? He had those happy ears and it was ready to go.
Oh, I totally know that. When I was starting with Scrum 2006, I was working for a startup in Hamburg, and the founder and CEO every Monday morning was totally excited from the weekend experience he had talking to friends and whoever. And he was always coming in Monday mornings, 9:30, with a pile of new ideas, what needs to be done immediately. And so we came up with the idea to collect all of those suggestions and then just ignore them for 3 weeks. And usually they were gone by that. No?
Exactly. It's it's interesting. So someone asked a question tied to this. So when it comes to pet projects, how do you feel about taking time to experiment?
Oh, absolutely a must, right? So I'm a big friend of product discovery and figuring out what is worth building, and you need to allocate time to that. There's no way around it. And I spent approximately half of my time as product owner and half of my time as Scrum Master. So when I was a product owner, put a lot of emphasis on including all the team members in the experimental work and in the user research. And this was an integral part. And I always try to explain to everyone, particularly developers, guys, writing code is the last part of our job. And hopefully it's not more than 30%, right? So the better we are at identifying what is worth building, the less code we have to write. And this was always the purpose. So we build real systems, collecting ideas from the organization, from customers, a way of getting an understanding which might be more or less valuable than running experiments, low fidelity, high fidelity experiments, until we then decided, okay, now we take them out of our funnel, our product backlog edition funnel, and transfer them into the product backlog. So we made very transparent in the whole organization how the process would work, that we're not discriminating, that everyone has a good chance to make good suggestions. And we also explained that once we take something over from the funnel into the backlog, it has a higher probability to be realized, but it doesn't mean it will be realized. And we made it really hard. We really created a threshold between the outside the product backlog and the product backlog to make sure that we really only have valuable stuff in the product backlog. So we are quite adamant about that.
Yeah, one of our participants notes if we stick to the rule that the product owner is the owner of the backlog, then number 4 can be avoided or certainly impacted quite well in that way. I think when we get to experiments, the question to me starts to come in. We can't just experiment on everything, otherwise we'll spend all of our time running experiments as well. So they still have to be prioritized as to what we're going to do. And as a product owner, I've certainly seen where you could end up spending all of your time working on those pet projects or shiny things just as experiments and never get to the work that needs to be done. Yes. So there are other questions coming in, not specific to this particular point. So maybe we'll come back to them and let you keep going a little bit.
Okay, so Eric, you would like the next one. Bonus at risk. I don't know who of you has ever worked for a sales-driven organization. I have in several startups, and we always had this influx of new feature requests shortly before the end of the quarter because sales wasn't meeting the quotas for the bonus, and they were frantically trying to actually meet their quotas. And there was this approach of let's throw at the wall and see what sticks. Yeah, maybe we can do this. And in a large corporation, I've rather seen the other way around. It's more like the sales guys start to sell features to close deals without talking to the Scrum team first. This is really nasty, particularly if we only learn about these features once the contract has already been concluded, probably including penalties for not delivering, etc. pay. Then you're in a position that actually your sales team is creating a product backlog, which is really nasty. Now, how can you figure out what is going on there? When I go through product backlogs, through a product backlog and have a look at the items, what I also try to understand is, okay, what was the lead time of a product backlog item? So when was it added to the product backlog, and when was it actually delivered to the customer? And it's really interesting to see when things come up that have a very short lead time. So of course, a priority 1 bug has an ultra short lead time, and it's supposed to be that way. But if there are regular features that have a significantly shorter lead time than all the other features that you probably have, so typically the distribution of the lead time is a typical Gaussian curve. If there's a very short lead time, this could be an indicator that those have found their way into the backlog by bypassing the Scrum team, the product owner, in some way that it's not expected to be. And that would be, for example, some good topic to dive into in talks and one-on-ones with other team members, figuring out, okay, what's happened there, but just to get an understanding how the organization is working.
So
and of course,
as a Scrum Master, Stefan, how do you impart that knowledge and understanding on the product owner? As the product owner, starts bringing these hot items into, say, even into the daily Scrum, or trying to bring them into the sprint backlog. How can we better educate them to understand the prioritization and how it becomes a distraction rather than a value add?
I always try to have data at hand. So approaching the product owner, it's like, yeah, I have a gut feeling that A, B, and C, it's typically not working. If you can show some graphs, if you have some data at hand, it's something completely different. Dear PO, can we have a coffee? I have some data here. I was going through our product backlog, and I would like to share that with you. That typically is a much better entree to the whole thing, because now we have data. It's not alternative facts. It is real facts, and then we actually can have an informed discussion. And by the way, it's taking it from there. It could also be a good topic for a retrospective. So gathering that kind of data really helps, not just in talking to the product owner, but also preparing a retrospective. And I would even see this as a meta-level retrospective. So please invite the stakeholders as well, and go through the findings, and then have a retrospective, and get a feeling for what the room is like. Maybe it's a topic that has been brewing for a long time, but no one has mentioned it before.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
None specific to this topic, so we'll hold off a little bit.
So the second nasty behavior that you find is prioritization by proxy. So as I mentioned earlier, Scrum works really good if the product owner has to say over what becomes content, what becomes part of the product backlog. And if that's not the case, if this is done by someone external, the CEO of a fast-growing startup that still has the final say over what is being built, right? Or some external stakeholder in a large organization, hey, I'm funding you, it's my budget, so you will build my features approach to Scrum. all of this means that it's actually not really working. So I know product owner is the Achilles heel of a Scrum team, absolutely. And we still have this idea of one product owner, one product backlog. Now, if you remove the product owner from that equation, you actually get a pretty good waterfall to zero through the back door, or sort of agile stage gate process, if that makes any sense. And typically you end up to become a feature factory, right? You're churning out feature after feature after feature. Output is more important, being busy, showing that you're a good part of the organization, that you're pulling your weight, and that you deserve your check at the end. So that is really critical. How can you spot those? Again, I go through items in the product backlog, and I try to understand items that have a prolonged refinement period, and items I like to look for items where there's a reference to external input is needed or external approval is needed. So you may be running in such a situation, a refinement session, you're working on a product backlog item, probably a developer mentions something, and the product owner concludes, okay, I have to ask someone else, I have to ask my decider, my decision individual or deciding individual, and you will take a note in the sense that PO will get back to X for clarification or something like that. So I look for these, try to figure out, okay, how much autonomy has our product owner?
There's an interesting question here from Iwan. If the product owner doesn't have the final say, are there guardrails or processes that we can put in place, or is this simply an indicator that Scrum isn't being committed to well enough for us to succeed?
Sometimes it's by design. So that pretend to run Scrum, but it's more Scrum bot when bot in capital letters. Sometimes it's an intermediary step within the transition process. Some organizations are not built to how shall I put it, to turn on a switch and then they go full Scrum from 1 second to another. They're not working that way. For example, in highly regulated industries, you always have a compliance or governance department that will want to have a say, because they're legally responsible for making sure that everything is compliant with the law. And you can't expect them to accept that there's a product owner from 1 second to another. That's a process. You have to integrate them into the process, and you have to find your way how to deal with those challenges. So you can't say immediately if the PO doesn't have to say this is not Scrum, and it really depends on the context and where they are in their journey. If they are at the beginning of the journey, okay, this is something that we should work on, right? If they've been trying this for 4 years and it's still no change, and you're the 7th Scrum Master working on this, probably that's an indication that in this setup it won't go anywhere, right? But again, you will quickly notice this, and partly you will notice this in the product backlog. So the good thing about all of these, what I mentioned here, is that you can do this in silence on your own by just having a look at, for example, the Jira or whatever project management tool or you are using for that purpose.
Thanks, Stefan.
So you don't have to ask anyone.
Thank you.
Okay, and the final one. There is no product vision. You can't derive any kind of product goal from that. It's just Alice in Wonderland, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. The problem is successful Scrum teams, in my experience, are comprised of missionaries. You want missionaries on your team. You don't want mercenaries. The issue is that missionaries want to have a purpose. Why are we doing these things? While mercenaries are satisfied with a check. And what I like to understand at the beginning of a new project when going through the product backlog is, okay, what is the vision? Is the vision manifesting itself in the composition of the backlog? Can I identify product goals? What would be the next step? Is there a pathway? Because otherwise, it's obvious that you need to change something here. And how can you spot this in the product backlog? Well, typically you have sprints where it will be very hard to come up with a sprint goal. So past sprints that do not have a sprint goal, for example, that if you look at them, look like a list of tasks without cohesion or alignment. Just a bunch of work items that the team was working on. Whenever you come across it, so the occasional cleanup sprint where you do all the small stuff, totally fine. This is life, right? But if this happens 4 out of 5 times, something is wrong. And I believe you can rather easily see this in the product backlog if you go through the tickets and if you take your time and look at this. And I would typically say half a day, 1 day is more than sufficient to get an understanding about this, even without much of briefing through other team members. So I really like to start doing this at the beginning, so I get my first my own insight into this before I start branching out, reaching out to other team members and invite them on coffees or ice cream or whatever is appropriate to have a little chat. Okay, so those were my top 10 product backlog issues, AntiPatterns, and there was also a small introduction into how you can use actually the product backlog for some forensic analysis of things that went wrong in the past, things and processes that probably are still not up to date, and so that you get better understanding. And by the way, this is a task both suited for Scrum Masters and product owners. Absolutely the same. I would always invest that time at the beginning of something new. So I'm joining a new team, for example. So, questions?
Hey, thanks, Stefan. We've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll try to take them the best that we can. There are several questions around refinement, so we'll take some of those. Before we get to there, Neil asks, definition of ready, is there some level of definition of ready that is acceptable? Identifying dependencies, dependents, exact, demo steps, etc.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to having a quality standard or having an extension of the working agreement as a team, how to do refinements. This is totally fine. What I'm wary of is having this codified definition of ready that you then track. So I was working for an organization that really defined a definition of ready and was tracking it. You won't believe it. There's a plugin for Jira doing that. And that quickly turned into really a sort of weapon for the interdepartmental communication. Because the developers quickly found out that, hey, this definition of ready is a good way of protecting us. So it was really completely not serving the purpose, and it was overridden all the time, by pressure from management. So don't codify it. It's important that we have a definition of done, absolutely, that it is codified and that we all know what this is, but keep it significantly less formalized as far as the definition of ready is concerned. Excellent. But I do agree. Please have a quality standard of what you like to see in a product backlog item. Mm-hmm.
Most definitely. So, like I said, there are a bunch of questions around refinement. It's hard to summarize them all because they're kind of going in some different places. Starting with, is there, and I'm not sure that there's really a good answer here, but I'll ask it anyway from Gemma. What's the optimum or average refinement duration for a story?
Ooh, That's a good question. I think, again, we have our typical Gaussian distribution here. I like small stories. So if you can cut stories as small as possible, probably you will need a few minutes on those, 10, 15, 20 minutes, probably. The larger the story, the more refinement you need, because there are so much hidden issues that you need to talk about. So do yourself a favor, make stories as small as possible, items as small as possible, as small as feasible, given your context. And I would even say that it's beneficial to come back to items. So I've always been supportive of the idea that we come back to a product backlog item 2 or 3 times to actually complete the refinement. So we talk about something until we run into an issue, a question that needs to be answered before we can continue. And then we just continue with another product backlog item and come back to that one when the question is answered. So refinement in my eyes is more kind of flow of consecutive refinement steps until we come to the desired outcome.
Great, thanks, Stefan. So kind of following that thread a little bit around refinement, Brigitte talks about the fact that their team is distributed. And do you have any recommendations, suggestions, ideas around how to work in managing refinement when the teams aren't co-located? As now we're all witnessing that quite heavily, of course.
So my suggestion number 1 would be refinement doesn't mean that everyone has to be in the same place at the same time or some virtual place. I like to have an alignment refinement session, let me put it this way, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, where everyone from the team gets together so that we have a joint collaborative approach to the backlog. But otherwise, just the folks that need to refine item should get together and do it whenever it's feasible. Now, in a remote setup, I would say, think about doing this asynchronously. Probably even by relying more on a written version instead of zooming every afternoon for 5 minutes and continue the refinement. This would be significantly easier, particularly if you're not located in the same time zone. As always, working remotely requires that you invest more into the written word and asynchronous working, but then it should really work. So that's why, for example, ticket systems are so helpful in the current situation. And why, for example, I'm not opposed to using Jira, although, of course, I like my index cards. Right?
So there's been a couple of questions here which are interesting around product ownership. A couple of people have talked about and asked questions around how do I handle when I have a product owner per team rather than a product owner per product. So I think there's some misunderstanding around Scrum here in the like. So how would you answer the question, can I have a product owner per team rather than a product owner per product? And how would people handle, now all of a sudden you're creating product decisions by democracy rather than by ownership and leadership?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to come to the tyranny of the majority here. I do like the idea that we have one product owner, one product leader for a product. How is this supposed to work with several Scrum teams? Everyone asks, and my approach has always been, and I've only worked with one occasion with 3 teams at the same time. Our approach has always been to include the developers in product backlog management as soon as possible and as early as possible. So all the developers fully understood that a part of the work of the product owner needs to be done by them. They need to shoulder it because the single individual cannot cannot work on a product backlog that is supposed to feed 3 teams and create value for the customer. You know, if you believe that the product owner is in charge of that work, you will quickly come to deteriorating value of the product backlog will be mediocre at best in my experience, because the poor individual will switch to things that keep the teams busy, you know, so they look good from the organizational perspective, but this automatically means that value creation for the customer will suffer. On the contrary, if you include your developers as soon as possible in the important jobs, like I mentioned before, running experiments, running user interviews, creating the product backlog items. So I wasn't writing in my time as product owner product backlog items. What I brought was the why. You know, I could provide the data and an explanation why something would be valuable. And maybe I created a ticket with a headline and a 1-sentence description, but all the rest was done by the developers. And there was no asking about that. No one expected me to write the product backlog items, right? And by the way, I couldn't have done so. There was too much other things to do. So one product owner works if that product owner is delegating much or majority of the product backlog management to the developers, which is really helpful. I would even extend that to much of the product discovery work. I can tell you, you can train your developers to run user interviews. It absolutely works, and it's magic, you know, because all this problem of critical information getting lost in translation is gone. So my suggestion, the more teams you have, the earlier you need to make sure that the developers accept work on the product side.
Thanks, Stefan. So Mark asked a question. This is related to number 7, just kind of looking for some clarity. Are you suggesting that product backlog items should be single line items and not grouped together in epics that they address?
No. I'm not saying that. I mean, epic is anyway a Jira term, I believe, but you can group them totally. No objection regarding that. It's helpful. I mean, I like to build my product backlogs to help stakeholders from the outside who do not spend 6 hours a day in the product backlog understand the product backlog. So it needs to be simple on the one side. It needs to be focused on the essence, but they need to also be readable, understandable by stakeholders. You cannot expect a stakeholder to spend more than half an hour on their product backlog a week, and that would be a lot. You know, so we try to make this as easy as possible for them.
Great, thanks, Stefan. So for outdated items or items that won't be included in the next, say, 3 or 4 sprints, how do you recommend that we track those so that they're not forgotten, but not clouding the product backlog at the same time?
I mean, what you could have is a second board, for example, where you put them. Or let's continue the Jira metaphor, create another project where you park these kind of tickets if you don't like to delete them because you're afraid you might need them in the future, but just get them out. Personally, I believe if you thought something would be important and then you didn't work on that for a long time, just delete it. If it's important, it will come back and then you recreate it. And by the time it comes back, it resurfaces, you will anyway have a better or different understanding of the situation. So you have to start over again anyway. I mean, I've never experienced that you take an old product backlog item, 9 months old, and you just can start working on it. Typically, you have to go through the whole refinement process again. And at the end, it's basically a new item that you create that way. So I would always say the trash bin is your friend. Get rid of this stuff. Go. Of course, in real life, this is more dramatic if you can uphold the trash bin and say, okay, go.
So here's an interesting one, and this ties very closely to our Professional Scrum with User Experience class. I think you're pretty familiar with it. Justin asks, this might be out of context. I don't think it is, Justin. I think it's a good question. We have big questions around UX tasks in the backlog. UX designers do work ahead of the sprint. They don't have to. But should those tasks be tracked in Scrum and in the backlog? And as we teach in our class, there's no reason those tasks can't be part of the sprint and actually start experimenting with them within the sprint. But do you have some thoughts there, Stefan?
So in my experience, what I've been practicing is basically get them all in one room and start working on this. Okay, but maybe that typically were a situation in which the team was very aware that if the UX designers told us, okay, in 2 days you have the you have the designs and you can start working on that, we accepted those items into the sprint without hesitation, because they always lived up to their promise. Otherwise, I would say always include the designers into the refinement sessions. I mean, if you're including the developers and the product research, in the sense that they run user interviews, you should do the same with the designers. You know, integrate them in the team as far as possible, and let them figure out how to best do this. This strict idea of, okay, first the UX is done, a sprint or two ahead, and then once we understand this, we hand it over, and then the code is done. Typically, it creates friction. And maybe it's organization driven, in the sense that there might be UX silo. From my perspective, I like to put them all into the same team and say, okay, you figure out what the best solution here is, come up with an idea how to do this best.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you're absolutely right. It starts to create an us and them. It doesn't give the time necessarily to see that delivering value, and really, if the UX design folks are moving forward based on their assumptions, then what have we validated and how have we validated that? And value delivered within a sprint doesn't necessarily have to be putting something into production. It could be validating that with stakeholders and getting that feedback. I know, you know, as a product owner, quite often we would create touchable and usable mock-ups so that we could get feedback from stakeholders, not just pictures, but you know, thinking way back into my early days as a product owner, using Visual Basic, because it was very easy to prototype, and it would have the drop downs and it would have the fill in, so I could put that in front of our stakeholders to really start to feel it and test it and validate that we're doing the right thing and implementing that, rather than just here's a design, you all go implement it, and then we'll keep moving forward. Bringing development and UX together on delivery.
Totally.
Awesome. So I want to be conscious of our time. We only have about a minute or so left. So if we can just move forward real quick, Stefan.
Sure.
And there we go. So we've hit the questions. Everybody keep on learning. We have learning paths on the website, and you can see the links and some details there for the different roles: developers, product owners, Scrum Masters, Agile leaders within the organization. Keep learning. To me and to Scrum.org, learning never stops. It's an ongoing process. We'll do our best to answer your questions via email. There were many more questions certainly than we were able to get to as normal. And I want to take this time, Stefan, to thank you. If you want to just jump to the next slide. Thank you. Thank our audience for taking the time today. I know we're all busy and lots of things popping up, so it was great to see such an amazing attendance. And with that, thank you all. Be safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Likewise.
Thanks, Stefan.